It can mean struggling day by day to get by. But in the end, the whole purpose is that your life will show others the route to God. Every suffering, every heartache, every trial. And if I'm going through difficult times and suddenly I decide to end it all, what I do is I leave those people who are following me abandoned. They've been watching to see how I will deal with my pain, my issues. And they're in the middle of the wilderness following me, thinking if Brother Bill can make it, I can make it. And then I end it all, and they are lost. Lost and confused and suffering the same pain. Why not for them to say, I'm going to do it too? Suicide by a believer leads to greater despair among fellow believers. King Saul was so afraid that if the Philistines captured him, they would mutilate his body, cut off his head, and put it on display. And you know what? That's exactly what they did. Sometimes you just can't stop people from doing what people are going to do. Sometimes you can't stop the television from giving the sensational news. It's going to happen. So Saul and his 3 sons died, and all his house died together. When all the Israelites in the valley saw that the army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They stripped him, took his head and his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news among their idols and their people. They put his armor in the temple of their gods and hung up his head in the temple of Dagon. When all the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of everything the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men went and took the bodies of Saul and his son and brought them to Jabesh. Then they buried their bones under the great tree in Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Now Saul had no choice as to whether or not he was going to die. He was backed into the corner. He had sinned. He was in a war that was caused by his very own sin. But he had one option. That option was to give his life in such a way that he could have inspired his people. If I die serving you, heart attack in the pulpit, tragic car wreck on the way to the hospital, I will become a saint. If I should take my life, you will question why you ever joined this church. You will question if your baptism is valid. You will question many other things. You see, all of us have this difficult position, this choice to make. And our one choice acceptable to God is to live and to die in such a way that people will be inspired by our staying strong. How should our church minister to people who are facing suicide, who have experienced that in their family? Number one, tell people that death is not our call. We think that we have the right and the ability to make all kinds of calls. We can determine so many things in life, but death is not one of those things we should determine. God has an appointed time for me to be born, for me to die, and for me to face judgment. Psalm 139:16, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So God said, I chose a time for you to go before you ever came. Before you were ever born, I already had your life laid out, a plan. Now, I know this gets real tough about, hey, I don't have to do anything because God's calling all the shots. No, it's as if God places in my hand a script, just as I have these sermon notes. And I read the script, and I look ahead and I see what the action is involved in the next act. Now, I can stay with the script, which is God's plan, or I can lay it aside and ad lib. Death is not our call. Secondly, some of you might be here this morning and you are having a problem dealing with your anger over someone committing suicide. You feel that that person really cheated you, betrayed you. And there are people whose lives can never function properly after that. God's solution is his solution to all other sins and hurts. Forgive that person and go on with your life. We are to forgive a person who commits suicide the same way that we forgive every other sinner. It is not the worst sin in the world. It is not the ultimate sin in the world. It's just definitely one of those sins that cannot be reversed or exchanged. But if you're hurting, God's prayer is that you would forgive that person. Thirdly, piece of advice. Never put pain on someone's shoulder. Doesn't have to be a big pain. It can be that small. But it may be the pain that tips the scale. How would you live if you had just hurt someone and the next day the person took his or her life? And maybe really it had nothing to do with what you said or did. But would you ever convince yourself that you were not guilty? Would you ever believe that you were innocent? And you know, it's amazing. I was lying there last night thinking about this sermon, and my two dogs were there, one on either side of me, you know, and I thought, you know, these dogs don't realize that they are both dogs chosen by me as their master to have my house as their home, where they are well fed, loved, taken to the vet when they need it. And yet these two dogs will growl at one another.